Today, I am interviewing a British native speaker who has lived in Oxford for a long time. Her name is Alison Le Cornu. Alison, can you briefly introduce yourself to Japanese viewers?
Yeah, by all means. Yes, I'm Alison. I've been an English teacher for most of my life, although not all of my life. I come from a small island called Jersey, which is near France, and it's independent. So it's British, but it's not belonging to the United Kingdom. We have our own language in Jersey. It's a very old Norman French. And I grew up with an English mother and a Jersey father, and so we didn't speak anything else other than English in the house. And so I lived there until I left school at 18, and I went to London, and then after that I've spent the rest of my life in education of one sort or another. So teaching English quite regularly throughout the whole of my career. Yeah.
I think that Japanese students of English would like to know how you have studied English and attained the level of fluency you have now. Can you begin with your English adventure from the day you were born to preschool days?
Yeah, it has been an adventure. I come from a family where, well, my mother was a teacher, and so I think she valued excellence. She was a music teacher, not an English teacher, but she valued excellence. And she valued English, and so she was always the major influence in my life as I was learning my native language. This was in the 1960s and 1970s, and so it was still a time when we believed that there were correct things to say in English, correct ways of speaking, correct ways of writing, correct ways of spelling, correct ways of pronouncing words, etc. So my mother was really quite strict with me and my brother and my sister, and making sure that we spelt correctly, that we handled our language well, and that we were able to communicate well, and that we were able to communicate with others and in writing and speaking effectively. And also she actually sent us to a school where she believed that the other pupils would be speaking well with a good accent, and she didn't want us to be speaking a sort of lower class English. And I think it's probably thanks to that I speak now what we call received pronunciation in Britain. It's a type of English which doesn't have a regional accent. You wouldn't know where I came from by the way that I speak now. So my mother was a big influence in the way that I learnt English. But after that, when I left school and I went to college, I began a teacher training course, and I discovered that it was possible to teach English as a foreign language to non-native speakers, and I was inspired by this idea. And so I did a very short course, just 4 weeks, and suddenly discovered that I had learnt more about my own language in those 4 weeks than I had done in the whole of my schooling. And so that was a really interesting thing. So I discovered what nouns and verbs and adjectives and prepositions were. And I discovered what tenses we have in English and when we use them. And I was fascinated by my own language. Now, I had learnt French alongside, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So I had done some other language learning alongside learning my own, but learning my own was a really important thing, and it's something that I've continued throughout the whole of my life. There are still things that I learn about my own native language, and that's, I think, why I love it and why I love teaching it.
How about your student days from primary and secondary school to universities?
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, in primary and secondary school, we were taught English, and we were taught English in quite a strict fashion, making sure that we got this notion of being correct. And I think that's probably changed now, but that was certainly part of the way that I grew up. When I moved into secondary school, English was compulsory, And I did it all the way through until I was 18. But funnily enough, I was not very good at it when I was in my last 2 years at school. I think part of the reason for that was because I was very busy, and actually the English language syllabus for us was, well, it wasn't language, it was literature. And so we were reading books and poems and analysing them. And for some reason, I, at that age, had not grasped the use and the benefit of analysis of my own language or anything else, come to that. And so I really wasn't very good at it. I was still in my mental mode of enjoying reading books for the enjoyment of reading books and the story and the narrative that they had, not because I was interested in how the author had crafted the book and how the author had designed and structured the book. So I really wasn't very good at English literature in my school days. And as I said, it wasn't until I grew older and I started to realise that I could actually study my own language in a completely different way, that I started to enjoy it and indeed be fascinated by it, and I continue that interest. Yeah.
After graduating from the university, how did your adventure change?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, it changed a lot, because my university was a music degree. I went to music conservatoire, so I really didn't do any English at all while I was at college. That was in London. But I took a gap year and I went to live in the United States for a year in New York. And there I was introduced to accents that I had never heard before. American accents from all over the United States. And of course, I was familiar with the fact that in England, we have different English accents according to the different region that you live. And we even have that in Jersey. The Jersey accent differs from the west of the island to the east, and that's in a very, very small place. So I was familiar with the idea that accents are often associated with locations and with areas of a country and groups of people. But I was really introduced to that in a big way in the United States. And after I'd finished my 9 months of working, I was able to travel around the United States and visit and hear and explore and just expand my understanding of how regional accents work. And then after that, I went to do my teacher training and qualified as a teacher. But I wasn't very enamoured with being a music teacher. I wanted to be an English language teacher, so I did my training to teach English as a foreign language to adults. And I went off firstly to Spain, to Madrid for 2 years, and then to France in a town called Angers for 3 years. And there I taught English to French and Spanish students in all sorts of varieties. I taught business English, I taught general English, I taught in companies, I taught youngsters, and I got to know my language much better then, and also enjoyed the challenge of learning to teach my language. That was a really creative thing. It's very interesting to me to find that people who don't speak a language, let's say my Spanish students, and my very first class was with a group of Spanish students who were complete beginners, and they had not a word of English, and I had not a word of Spanish, and I had to make them understand. And I discovered you do that through a whole variety of ways. Sometimes it's gesture, sometimes it's writing on the blackboard, sometimes it's pointing, sometimes it's acting and miming. So teaching takes all sorts of different forms, and learning takes all sorts of different forms as well. And so my ability to learn and also then teach my own language developed enormously in France and Spain. And I went back to Spain a couple of years later and had another 2 years working, teaching English or writing English courses. And then when I returned to English, I just carried on teaching English to non-native speakers in a part-time capacity. I was working full-time in universities, and I did some teaching in the universities. I and I did some teaching in the evenings and private teaching. And all the time I was learning two things. I was learning about my language, but I was also learning how to teach it. And those two things for me became almost inseparable. And that's how I do the majority of my learning of my language, is by teaching it and having to think about the questions and the answers of the questions that my students ask me. I don't have to say so often now, sorry, don't know the answer to that one, but it still does happen. Still does happen, and then I have to go running to the books and see if I can find an answer to the question. Yeah.
Do you speak any other languages? How and when did you learn them?
Well, yes, I do, because Jersey is very, very near France, and so we have a lot of French people who come on holiday, often for just a day. Or a little bit longer. But when you grow up in a tiny little island like Jersey, which is so near France, you hear French being spoken around you all the time. So I was quite familiar with hearing French, and we were taught it at school. I started learning it at the age of 10. And then when I was age 15 or 16, I got a job in a shop in the centre, in the main town. And that was when I really began to speak French, because I was hearing the French spoken in the street, and then a lot of the French tourists came into the shop, and I was able to speak to them when they asked me for things and tried to pay money, etc. So my French began to develop quite well by the age of 16 or 17, and after that, of course, I went to live in France, and my French became quite good, to the point that I was able to communicate quite fluently and give guided tours around Jersey to French people speaking in French. When I went to Spain, as I said, I didn't speak a word of Spanish, so I had to learn from scratch, and I did that in a very sort of integrated way. So I bought a book that was designed to teach. It was a self-study book of Spanish, and so I studied that when I was travelling to work on the metro and travelling home from work at the end of the day on the metro. So I studied that, and it had answers to the exercises in the back of the book, so I could sort of see whether I was right or wrong. Then I found an Englishman who was married to a Spanish lady, and he gave me lessons in English, which some people really disapproved of, but I found it really useful because I had plenty of opportunity to practice my Spanish. I was living in the country, but I could then ask this English teacher some very sophisticated questions about the language that I was learning that I had. That was quite helpful. And then yeah, I just made lots of Spanish friends, and they helped. And the more I spoke it, the more fluent I became, and it became quite natural. But interestingly, and I'm sure some of you will recognize this, when I left Spain, I was quite fluent, but now 30 years later, I can still understand a lot of it, but I'm not so good at speaking it, and it gets rusty. So there's a lesson: keep it up, keep it up. And I might now start looking for a language partner now that I'm teaching on italki, and I can possibly find a language partner for my Spanish.
Looking back now, what is the most important advice you can give to Japanese in order for them to be able to speak English as fluently as you?
That's quite a hard question, because obviously, a Japanese student of English is not a native speaker, and I was a native speaker when I was learning English. So, and I think that makes a real difference. But in my experience as a teacher of English, the students who make greatest progress are the students who are bold enough to make mistakes, and who are bold enough to try something out, and who are not very self-conscious. They don't mind making mistakes. They don't mind trying something, largely because in a one-to-one capacity I can also help, and I can stop them and I say, this is what you said and this is what you need to say. So there's a little bit of help there, but don't be afraid. Try it. Most people won't mind that you're trying it. In fact, most people will appreciate that you're trying something. But I would also suggest that you do as much as you can. So for me, that a self-study textbook was a real help for me. And I didn't need a teacher. It was just me and the book. And that worked extremely well because it was very structured and it progressed in small steps. And I found that a very useful thing. If you've got a chance, go and live in the country, obviously, any of the countries that speak English. We've all got different accents: Australia, South Africa, England, Ireland, America, and we've all got hundreds of different accents. So you can take your pick as to what sort of accent you want to speak with, and then do all of the listening as well. If you can become a good listener, you'll probably become a good speaker. And so if you can listen to any of the radio stations, the BBC obviously has got a lot of different radio stations depending on what you like. But there are many other radio stations not run by the BBC. Try and watch and listen to films and documentaries on the television. Try to listen, but don't just listen passively. Listen analytically and say to yourself, yes, that's how they said this, and make a note of it if you can. So that you're actually, I'm sure you can understand a lot, but don't just listen because you can understand. Listen and try to analyze what you're hearing and make a note of what it was that you wouldn't have known how to say until you heard it on the as part of the film. So I think those are some of the main ways in which I would say learn English, and then just speak it, try it, practice.
Right. I'm sure your advice would motivate and spur them on to study more and achieve their goals in the future. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Well, I hope it will, and very, very good luck to all of you.
Thank you.